See the starter right there. Customer has been beating on it to get it to start, and so it may be a bad starter. I don't know. I haven't looked into it yet. I have looked at it long enough to see that it has it needs all new belts on it. The seat, I don't think they're going to replace that. This is just something I was sitting on. The parking switch doesn't work correctly. The engine's completely covered with mud. I'm pretty sure it's a Kohler. It's kind of hard to tell from all the mud on it. And of course it needs an oil change. But I also noticed when I went to start it that I didn't have to beat on it. All I had to do was cycle the clutch back and forth. This mower has a clutch on the left and a brake on the right. Unlike some mowers only have 1 foot control. This one has 2. It's more like an old car. So I'm going to tear into this, and as I run into things I'll try to tape it. First thing I'm going to do is try to get that deck off of there. It has a spring assist deck. I have to be a little careful taking it off, because one time I took one off and the spring came off and I had an awful time. But anyway, I'll be careful. I'll get back to you. Alright, now I'm going to try to figure out where this clutch switch is. Now that I got the deck out of the way. When I say clutch, I mean the traction or the drive. While I'm under here, I'll look at the belts. And as you can see, they got cracks in them, so I'm going to have to replace all the belts. I figured I would. It's not going to be fun either. Anyway, when I find the switch, I'll tell you. Can't find any kind of a switch except for a neutral switch, which does work. So now I'm going to make sure I'm not missing something. I've unplugged this wire that goes right here. This is what kicks in the starter. I'm going to check this wire and see if I'm getting 12 volts to the solenoid. Right here, I'm going to check and see with this wire. I'm going to check to see if I'm getting 12 volts. I'm taking my black lead. I'm just using a jumper. It happens to be red, but I'm using a jumper. I just jumped it to something metal on the frame. And now I'm going to plug my multimeter into here and see if I'm getting 12 volts. Okay, I've got the lead right from my multimeter into that wire. I'm going to set it to DC volts. I'm going to go to 20 volts. You can see we got nothing. I'm going to turn this key switch, make sure it's in neutral. Turn the key switch and watch my multimeter. And I am getting 12 volts. That pretty much eliminates everything on the tractor except the starter. So it looks like I got a starter problem. Many starters won't have this. This is more like an old car starter. This red line right here comes directly from the battery. This got 12 volts on it all the time. And this small wire that I just checked uses that 12 volts. the same 12 volts, only from a different source, from the key, to make this the starter kick into gear. So I'm going to pull this whole starter off, but first I'm going to disconnect the battery so that I don't have a hot wire hanging out here. Positive, negative. When I disconnect the battery, I always disconnect the negative first. That way if my tool happens to hit something metal while I'm taking off the positive, it won't short out the battery. Okay, now I have the negative disconnected from the battery. Now I can take the positive off. Alright, now I have the positive and the negative off the battery. So now I have no power to this machine. Now I can safely take off the wire and pull the starter. I have the positive lead coming away from the starter, and I have the signal wire. This is the first one I checked, unplugged. Now I'm going to take off this little guard to keep your fingers out of the gears. And then I'm going to pull this starter by pulling out these two bolts right here. Can you see that bolt? And that bolt. And then the whole starter will come off. Then I can inspect the whole thing. These two bolts loose, they turned out to be 10mm wrench to get them off. Got the cover off. And I put the bolts back in without the cover, so I don't have to keep trying to find out what bolt goes where. I'm going to go ahead and take these bolts out and check the starter out. Okay, I have the starter off the machine, and I can see that the teeth are all torn up inside of it. Lots of rust, and from what it looks like, there's a lot of clearance. I don't know if you can see it, but it does say it's a CV12.5. CV12.5S. Spec number 1249. So rather than charge this customer $100 to tear it all apart and try to rebuild it and buy all the pieces, I'm probably going to give them a cut on the starter, and they're very expensive starters. $207 for this one little starter.